It is midday on a Mississippi cotton plantation around 1850. The air shimmers with heat. A young mother works frantically in an endless row, a burlap sack around her neck already heavy with cotton bolls. Her little boy, no more than 5, totters nearby with a gourd of water, trying to keep up. Sweat stings her eyes, but she cannot pause to wipe her face. Behind her, the hoofbeats of an overseer's horse grow louder. She forces her aching back straight and quickens her pace, heart pounding. Every cotton boll she plucks could mean the difference between survival and brutal punishment. Every moment counts, because when the sun sets and the cotton is weighed, anyone who falls short of the quota will pay in pain. On this plantation, like thousands of others across the American South, human life is calibrated to the demands of commerce. At dawn's first light, dozens of enslaved black men, women, and children trudged into these fields. Now, under the blistering sun, they form long, staggered lines of bent backs and moving hands. Each person is expected to pick a certain weight of cotton by day's end, a quota determined by the planter's need for profit. Now, what if I told you that the system trapping that woman in the cotton field years ago never really died? That the quota she's racing against, the number that decides whether she eats or bleeds, didn't vanish with emancipation. It was perfected, sanitized, rebranded. In this video, we're going to break down exactly how plantation slavery helped invent the core mechanics of capitalism as we know it. We'll see how human bodies were recorded, compared, and evaluated with chilling precision, how punishment became a tool for regulating performance, and how fear proved to be an extraordinarily efficient method of extraction. Long before corporations spoke the language of motivation or incentives, this system had already learned that pressure works better than persuasion. Now, this isn't to say that capitalism and slavery are identical. It's about showing that capitalism didn't accidentally brush up against slavery, rather it learned from it. And once you see that, the modern world starts to make a disturbing amount of sense. Let's begin. We're still in 1850. The overseer on horseback carries a braided leather whip coiled at his side. A silent promise of what happens if the quota is not met. There is no real rest beyond a few gulps of water or a hurried bite of cornmeal. As the hours drag on, fingers become shredded by the sharp cotton husks. Bowls prick and cut, but still the hands keep plucking in a steady rhythm. Children too young to pick scurry with water pails, and the elderly or sick strain to keep up despite dizziness and heat. The plantation demands that everybody be pushed to its limit. When dusk finally creeps in, the field hands stagger out of the rows, carrying sacks bursting with cotton. They gather at the barn or weighing station where the day yield is tallied on a scale. It is nearly pitch dark by the time this reckoning comes. One formerly enslaved man later remembered that at day's end, you couldn't distinguish the cotton plants from the weeds in the darkness. One by one, each person's sack is hung on the iron hook of the scale. The weight is called out, and an assistant records it in a ledger. If an enslaved worker's haul comes up light, even by a few pounds, the consequence is immediate and brutal. The overseer's whip cracks through the humid night air. A short day's work, as the masters call it, is punished with lashes on the spot. Many plantations follow an exacting rule. For every pound below the quota, the person receives a lash of the whip. 10 pounds short, 10 lashes. 20 pounds, 20 lashes. The punishment is calibrated like another line in the account book. Under this system, torture itself has been made routine, literally built into the process of weighing and selling. Cotton. Such calculated cruelty is not arbitrary. It is the driving engine of the plantation economy. Enslavers have learned that with enough terror, they can force greater productivity out of each human being. And so, year by year, the quotas creep higher, and the picking sacks grow heavier. In the Carolina rice swamps and Louisiana sugar fields, in the tobacco patches of Virginia, and the cotton fields of Mississippi, enslaved people are being worked harder than ever before. A generation ago, few would have believed a single person could pick hundreds of pounds of cotton in one day. But now, it has become common. Over the first half of the 19th century, an enslaved field hand's average daily cotton harvest skyrocketed, doubled and redoubled under relentless pressure. Planters brag in their journals about record-picking races, where men and women gather astonishing amounts when driven by competition and fear. What no new machine achieved, the whip and the threat of it did. A revolution in labor productivity wrung out of human flesh. By every cruel measure of efficiency, the plantation is a success. These estates have turned southern soil and enslaved labor into rivers of cotton and cane that feed an insatiable market. In a single season, one plantation might produce tens of thousands of pounds of cotton fiber. Multiply that by the vast patchwork of plantations across the South, and you have an ocean of raw material flooding into commerce. Bales of cotton, each weighing several hundred pounds, are pressed and loaded onto river steamboats and rail cars, bound for textile mills and trading houses. Barrels of sugar and molasses roll out of Louisiana's sugar refineries. The wealth extracted from these fields is transforming not only the South, but the entire United States and beyond. On the docks of New Orleans, Mobile, and Charleston, goods from plantations are exchanged for hard currency and loaded onto ships bound across the ocean. Every cotton ball, plucked by that young mother's bleeding fingers, will eventually travel thousands of miles and pass through many hands, from merchants to factory owners, fueling industries in distant lands. The enslaved toilers in the cotton rows likely never see the world beyond the plantation's boundaries, but the products of their toil reach across the globe. Tonight, on the Mississippi plantation, the day's work is finally done. The mother in the cotton field returns to a dirt-floored cabin, shoulders burning, fingers cut and swollen. Her child is already asleep on a scrap of burlap. She lies down exhausted, knowing tomorrow will bring the same ordeal. She does not know how her labor connects to distant markets, or that her cotton makes fortunes for people she will never meet. But it does. The labor of enslaved families like hers is fueling a booming economy. Far away, in northern cities and English mill towns, factories hum with activity because of the raw material she and countless others have picked. The plantation may seem isolated, but it is the beating heart of a growing capitalist world. Now, we leave the moonlit cotton fields of the South and follow the path of these cotton bales and sugar barrels as they flow outward, binding the southern United States to a global economy, and we will see how the gears of international capitalism turned upon the suffering of enslaved people. A paddle wheel steamboat chugs down the Mississippi River under the burning sun, its decks piled high with cotton bales wrapped in burlap. As the boat glides into the port of New Orleans, a frenzy of activity erupts. Dock workers strain to unload the stacks of cotton. Well-dressed cotton brokers stride along the wharf, inspecting the fibers and recording prices in ledgers. The cotton picked by enslaved hands on distant plantations has now become a commodity on the world market. From New Orleans, these bales will sail for Liverpool, England. There, In the busy docks, the cargo is unloaded into vast warehouses and put up for sale. British traders haggle over the heaps of raw cotton as factory agents secure the vital inputs for their textile mills. The fruits of the plantations stream outward into the arteries of global commerce, ready to be spun and woven an ocean away. By the mid-19th century, the American plantation South is the beating heart of a worldwide industrial economy. Cotton is in tremendous demand, the key ingredient for the booming textile industry that clothes the world. In England's factory towns like Manchester, brick mills throb with machinery, rows of power looms clatter relentlessly, tended by weary workers who feed in cotton from across the sea. The fiber that an enslaved woman in Mississippi harvested is spun into thread and woven into cloth in a smoky English mill. Some of that cheap cloth, in a cruel irony, is shipped back to America as coarse Negro cloth to be worn by the very people who grew the cotton. It is a vicious loop of exchange. British and Northern factories profit by selling goods to slaveholders, while slaveholders profit by selling cotton to those factories. This global supply chain is the spine of 19th century capitalism, and enslaved black labor lies at its root. The scale of wealth generated by this system is staggering. Cotton quickly became the United States' most valuable export. By 1840, cotton alone accounted for over half of all American export earnings, more than every other export combined. Year after year, millions of pounds of cotton poured out of southern ports. And it was not only cotton. Plantations in Louisiana sent out tons of sugar. Virginia and Kentucky shipped tobacco. The Carolina Lowcountry exported rice. But cotton reigned supreme. Southern politicians proudly declared that cotton is king, convinced that no nation on earth could do without the fluffy staple their slaves produced. They had reason to boast. American plantations were supplying well over 2/3 of the raw cotton, feeding Britain's gargantuan textile industry. Across the industrialized world, countless jobs and businesses depended on this slave-grown cotton. Entire industries would have starved of raw material without it. The profits funneling back to the South made plantation owners some of the richest people in the world. In the fertile Mississippi Valley, cotton planters built columned mansions and lived like aristocracy. In fact, this region boasted more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the United States. On the eve of the Civil War, fortunes built directly on the toil of enslaved people. Banks, both Southern and Northern, eagerly financed the expansion of this lucrative system. New Orleans became a banking hub flush with cotton money, rivaling even New York in financial clout. British and Dutch financiers extended credit to American planters and invested in Southern infrastructure, confidently wagering on the continued boom of slave-produced commodities. Capitalism was in full swing, with cotton the prized commodity and enslaved labor the engine driving it forward. In distant offices up north and overseas, financiers and industrialists were deeply entwined in the business of slavery. Northern insurance companies issued policies on enslaved people, treating black lives as insurable property. Wall Street firms brokered the sale of Southern cotton and tobacco, extending loans to plantation owners and reaping fees from this commerce. Merchants in Manhattan and Boston acted as middlemen, marketing the South's crops abroad and shipping in manufactured goods to sell to plantations. Everything from rough cloth to farm tools. Even the federal government benefited. Tariffs and taxes on slave-grown exports filled federal coffers. The wealth from plantations did not stay confined to the South. It flowed through the entire American economy. America's rapid economic growth in the pre-Civil War era was inseparable from the millions of enslaved hands that made that growth possible. Perhaps the clearest illustration of slavery's centrality to the national economy is this. By 1860, the nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans in the South had a collective value estimated at over $3 billion, more than the combined value of all factories, railroads, and banks in the United States. In other words, human beings themselves, enslaved black men, women, and children, were the single largest financial assets in America. They were literally the capital in American capitalism. Enslaved people were bought and sold like any other valuable goods. They were used as collateral for loans. They appeared on balance sheets and in wills. Far from being a backward relic, slavery was the beating heart of the nation's prosperity. Planters themselves operated as shrewd businessmen as well as grand landowners. They continually invested in new land and new technology, such as the cotton gin and improved seed varieties, to increase yields. They kept meticulous records of each enslaved worker's output, pushing to maximize every day's haul. Work on the plantations was divided and regimented, much like in a factory, with overseers driving the laborers to maintain punishing efficiency. A large plantation was run like a business enterprise. The owner as chief executive, overseers as managers, and enslaved workers as a coerced workforce. Through these methods, southern plantations achieved astonishing productivity. Observers in the 1850s were amazed and horrified at how much cotton a slave labor gang could produce under the lash. In effect, it was an industrial operation in everything except the humanity of its labor arrangements. This roaring trade based on human bondage carried immense consequences. It tied the fate of the entire United States to slavery in a way that would later prove catastrophic when political conflicts over the issue exploded. Southern slaveholders believed their economic power gave them political power, and they were right for a time. They dominated Congress and the presidency for decades, ensuring that no laws truly threatened their interests. Northern merchants and European manufacturers, even if some found slavery distasteful, were complicit or silent because their own prosperity depended on the plantation output. Thus, an entire global system of commerce and industry rested on the bent backs of enslaved laborers in America. Yet even as the wealth rolled in, an uneasy truth loomed. This wealth was built on an immense crime against humanity. In time, moral and political conflicts over slavery would reach a breaking point. But in the heyday of King Cotton, those conflicts were largely pushed aside by the imperatives of profit. Next up, we turn from the economics of slavery to the ideology and violence that sustained it. We will examine how the enslavers and their allies justified a system of such barbarity in a nation that professed ideals of liberty, and how an entire society was mobilized to keep millions of people in bondage. Night in the pine forests of Georgia, 1853. A lone figure crashes through the underbrush, barefoot and bleeding, a satchel of cornbread slung over his shoulder. He is an escaped slave, fleeing the plantation under cover of darkness. Behind him, the baying of hound dogs cuts through the muggy night air. The slave patrol is on his trail, his lungs burn as he splashes through a muddy creek. "There he is!" a voice shouts. Within moments, the runaway is dragged from the undergrowth, arms pinned and chest heaving. A rope is slipped around his wrist. His desperate bid for freedom has failed. By dawn, he's back at the plantation, tied to a whipping post as the overseer lays on lash after lash, in front of the assembled slaves. The others are forced to watch this gruesome spectacle, a brutal reminder of what happens to those who dare challenge the system. Violence is the linchpin of the plantation order. While the economy of slavery runs on profits, it is maintained by the whip, the shackle, and the gun. Every aspect of an enslaved person's life is controlled by the constant threat of punishment or death. Enslavers organize slave patrols, roving bands of armed white men, often empowered by local law, who prowl roads and woods at night, hunting for anyone without permission to travel. Across the South, laws known as slave codes give almost unlimited power to slave owners and overseers to enforce discipline. It is illegal for enslaved people to gather without a white supervisor present. It is illegal to teach them to read or write, for knowledge might spark rebellion. Any hint of resistance, a suspicious meeting, a whispered plan, can bring swift and savage retribution. The entire society is mobilized to keep the enslaved population subjugated. Judges, sheriffs, and legislators all play their part. A white person is rarely punished for killing or abusing a slave, and statutes explicitly define enslaved people as property with virtually no legal rights. In one notorious ruling in the 1850s, the U.S. Supreme Court declared that black people had no rights that any white person was bound to respect. Oh, this is white supremacy written into law, the belief that one race was born to dominate and the other to obey. That poisonous ideology seeps into every justification slaveholders offer for their system. In earlier days, some Southerners half-apologetically called slavery a necessary evil that would eventually fade away. But by the 1830s, they boldly insist that slavery is a positive good. Politicians, newspaper editors, and clergymen in the South weave elaborate rationalizations to defend human bondage. They claim that black Africans are naturally inferior and suited only for servitude, that they could not survive on their own and are better off under the care of white masters. Enslavers fashion themselves as benevolent patriarchs. In their view, they feed, Christianize, and civilize a supposedly childlike race in exchange for loyal labor. Of course, this delusion ignores the daily atrocities of the plantation. But denial is a powerful tool. A planter might boast that slavery civilizes an inferior race, even as outside a slave is being whipped. Many Southern churches often bless the slave regime. Pro-slavery preachers cherry-picked scripture about servants obeying masters and assured congregations that slavery was part of God's ordained plan. Not everyone in America was willing to accept these lies. Abolitionist voices in the North called slavery a sin and demanded its end, and enslaved people themselves never ceased yearning for freedom. But within the South, any dissent was violently silenced. In the 1830s, Southern postmasters burned abolitionist mail rather than deliver it, and anyone suspected of anti-slavery views faced intimidation or exile. The South became a closed fortress, intolerant of criticism and fearful of any spark of rebellion. Slaveholders' fear was not unfounded. Enslaved African Americans resisted in countless ways, undermining the system even as it tightened around them. Some acts of resistance were quiet but persistent, breaking tools, feigning illness, working as slowly as they dared. Everyday acts of sabotage to reclaim a shred of autonomy. Others were riskier. Some attempted the perilous journey north to escape to freedom. And at times, anger and desperation exploded into open revolt. Slave uprisings were rare and brutally suppressed, but they haunted slave owners' nightmares. In 1831, an enslaved preacher named Nat Turner led a rebellion in Virginia that killed dozens of whites before it was violently put down. The event horrified slaveholders across the South. In response, states passed even harsher laws and strengthened their patrols and militias. Enslavers claimed they had to impose even stricter controls to keep savages from rising up using fear to justify further cruelty. At the core of the plantation's grip was the systematic breaking of the enslaved person's will. Physical torture was routine. The whip on bare backs, stocks, and chains to immobilize, dogs trained to hunt and maul runaways. Psychological torture was ever present as well. Families were torn apart as a matter of course. A mother sold away from her husband and children for an owner's profit. On the auction block, children are separated from parents, shattering families forever. Enslaved women endured sexual abuse by masters and overseers with impunity. Any child born from such a violation was simply added to the owner's inventory, literally increasing his stock of human property. All of this was justified by the twisted logic that black people were not fully human and thus not entitled to any rights. If one believes that an entire people is naturally suited for slavery, then even the most appalling acts can be rationalized as necessary or even kind. White Southern society largely closed ranks around this brutal order. Even whites who owned no slaves were taught to feel racially superior and to support the system, glad to know that no matter how poor they were better than black people. Slavery was not just an economic institution, but the foundation of Southern society's hierarchy, a cornerstone of the planter elite's power and identity. By 1860, Southern leaders were so committed to slavery that they chose to secede from the United States rather than see it threatened. The result was the Civil War, a bloody 4-year conflict that would decide the fate of slavery in America. When the Civil War ended in 1865, slavery was formally abolished, and 4 million enslaved people were legally free. Many hoped that the nightmare of plantation bondage had finally been destroyed for good. But although the laws changed, the attitudes and power structures did not evaporate overnight. The plantation system left deep scars, and a cadre of former masters determined to maintain white supremacy and a supply of cheap black labor by other means. Now, let's see how, after emancipation, new systems of exploitation and racial control rose from the ashes of slavery, ensuring that the spirit of the plantation would live on in new guises. 18 years after emancipation, the sun rises over a coal mine in Pratt City, Alabama in 1883. Deep underground, the orange glow of torches reveals a hellish scene. Dozens of black men, stripped to the waist and slick with sweat, swing pickaxes at a coal seam. The ankles are shackled together, and each swing of the pick brings a groan of exhaustion. These are not free laborers. They are prisoners leased by the state to a private mining company. Above ground, armed guards keep watch, rifles in hand. The air is thick with coal dust and human desperation. A young man collapses to his knees, choking on the dust. A foreman strides over and strikes him with a rod, snarling that he'll work or die. Here, many do die. His crime was vagrancy. In reality, simply being a black man without work in a society determined to extract his labor by any means. After the Civil War, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution outlawed slavery, except as a punishment for crime. Almost immediately, Southern states seized on that exception as a loophole to continue the plantation's legacy. They passed laws known as Black Codes, which turned minor offenses into crimes aimed squarely at the newly freed black population. A black person could be arrested for loitering or not having proof of employment, or for absurd infractions, like speaking too loudly in public or walking on the wrong side of the road. Once convicted, often in sham trials before all-white juries, they were handed over to a new form of bondage, convict leasing. States and county authorities leased prisoners, the vast majority of them black, and many of them former slaves or their children, to private companies hungry for cheap labor. In the 1870s and 1880s, black prisoners were leased to work in coal mines, lumber camps, brickyards, railroad construction crews, and cotton plantations. They were forced to work long days under brutal and dangerous conditions, often under the whip and in chains. Slavery in all but name. For the white authorities and businessmen who ran the system, it was extremely profitable. States earned substantial revenue by renting out convicts, and companies got a disposable workforce they didn't have to pay beyond basic subsistence. If a leased prisoner collapsed or died from the abuse, the company could simply request a replacement from the local jail. Unlike the old slave owners, who at least had an economic incentive to keep an enslaved person alive and somewhat healthy, the new masters of convict labor had no such qualms. Prisoners were seen as completely expendable. The human toll was horrific. In some convict camps, mortality rates climbed shockingly high due to beatings, accidents, disease, and sheer exhaustion. Entire prison barracks would be stricken with pneumonia or malaria and left without proper care. Convict leasing became a pillar of southern economies by the 1890s, generating huge revenues for states like Alabama. The practice was so lucrative that authorities had every incentive to arrest more black people for trifling offenses just to keep the supply of convict labor flowing. Not all the exploitation of black labor after the Civil War took the form of outright chains. For millions of freedmen and freedwomen across the South, a different kind of plantation slavery re-emerged through the sharecropping system. In the decades after emancipation, most black families had few opportunities to truly own land or find independent livelihoods. The promise of 40 acres and a mule, land for the formerly enslaved, had been betrayed. The vast majority of emancipated people owned no land at all. Instead, many entered into sharecropping contracts with white landowners, returning to work the very same soil as before, but now under a nominally free labor arrangement. In theory, sharecroppers farmed a portion of a planter's land in exchange for a share of the harvest. In reality, these contracts were one-sided and oppressive. Black families would rent land, tools, and seed from a white landlord, often on credit at steep interest. At harvest, the landlord claimed a large share of the crop and added arbitrary fees and inflated charges to the tenant's account. More often than not, the sharecropper was told he owed more than he earned, an endless cycle of debt. If a family tried to leave before settling that supposed debt, local sheriffs or white vigilantes would force them back. It was a system designed to resemble slavery as closely as possible. Black people tied by debt to plantations, unable to advance, and constantly under the threat of destitution or violence if they challenged the arrangement. By the turn of the 20th century, the American South had rebuilt an economy on the backs of its black laboring class, now stripped of nearly all political power and hemmed in by a web of legal and extra-legal controls. Jim Crow laws imposed strict racial segregation and reinforced the message that black citizens were second class and should not aspire beyond menial roles. The right to vote, briefly exercised by black men during Reconstruction, was snatched away through intimidation, discriminatory literacy tests, and outright terror. This ensured the planter class and their allies stayed in power and could continue exploiting black labor without interference. White supremacist groups like the KKK and other Night Riders enforced this social order through violence, targeting black individuals who showed any sign of independence or success. A black sharecropper who saved a bit of money or dared dispute a landlord's account might find a burning cross in his yard or face brutal violence. Lynching and beatings were used as dread tools of discipline far beyond the prison walls, enforcing a grim racial hierarchy. Through convict leasing, sharecropping, and Jim Crow oppression, the South in the late 19th and early 20th centuries succeeded in resurrecting key features of the plantation system. The racial caste hierarchy remained essentially intact. Whites on top, black people at the bottom laboring for their benefit. The methods had evolved, but the goal was the same: to extract labor and uphold white domination. Change came slowly. Under public pressure, states gradually abolished convict leasing, though chain gangs of prisoners toiling on roads and farms persisted for decades. Sharecropping only began to wane in the 1930s when machinery and the economic upheaval of the Great Depression upended the old labor model, and Jim Crow's legalized segregation and black disenfranchisement endured into the 1960s, until the civil rights movement finally forced those laws to fall. Yet despite the end of those systems, the legacy of the plantation continued to cast a long shadow. The descendants of enslaved people, now technically free and equal under the law, still faced towering economic disparities and entrenched racism. The plantation had set into motion patterns of racialized labor exploitation that did not stop at the South's borders. They would echo in factories and fields across the nation, and as global capitalism expanded around the world. In the next part, we widen our view to the modern era to see how the plantation's brutal blueprint of cheap labor and racial hierarchy lives on in new forms of exploitation across the globe. On April 24th, 2013, a massive concrete building in Dhaka, Bangladesh, pancaked to the ground in a matter of minutes. This was Rana Plaza, an 8-story garment factory complex where thousands of low-wage workers, mostly young women, stitched clothing for global fashion brands. Cracks had been spotted in the walls the day before, but factory bosses threatened to fire anyone who didn't come in. Now the entire structure had collapsed like a house of cards, trapping workers in a mountain of rubble. Amid the smoke and concrete dust, survivors' screams pierced the air. By the time rescue crews finished pulling bodies from the debris, more than 1,100 people were dead and over 2,000 injured. In the wreckage among shattered sewing machines and bales of bright fabric, searchers found labels bearing familiar Western brand names. The world reacted in horror at the scale of the tragedy, but for the Western companies involved, disasters like this had become part of the cost of doing business on the cheap. The shirts and jeans sold to consumers in London and New York had been made under conditions not far removed from a sweatshop nightmare. Workers locked in an unsafe building, pushed to meet impossible quotas for paltry pay. The collapse of Rana Plaza threw a harsh spotlight on the global supply chains of modern capitalism. In the early 21st century, corporations have spread their production across the globe in search of the lowest labor costs. Much as 19th century planters sought ever cheaper sources of field labor, this has created a vast underclass of factory workers and miners, in developing countries who toil for a fraction of what workers in wealthy countries earn. Many of these laborers are people of color in formerly colonized nations. The global South providing cheap hands for the global North's appetite, a pattern that traces straight back to the colonial plantation. Inside sweltering textile mills in Bangladesh, electronics assembly plants in China, and cobalt mines in the Congo, the scenes can be hauntingly familiar. There are long lines of workers bent over tasks for 12 or 14 hours a day, sometimes in locked facilities with few safety measures. Conditions one step above bondage. When one group of workers collapses or demands better conditions, big companies often simply shift their orders to another country where labor is more desperate and regulations are lax. The result is a race to the bottom, reminiscent of the most ruthless, low-road capitalism of the past. The echoes of the plantation reverberate clearly in these modern practices. The logic remains the same: maximize output and minimize cost, even if it means human lives are shortened and dignity is stripped away. Back in the United States, one need not look far to find similar dynamics. Consider America's sprawling prison system, home to over 2 million inmates, a disproportionately large number of them Black or Latino. Thanks to that old loophole in the 13th Amendment, incarcerated people across the country can be made to work for pennies an hour. In some states, they receive no pay at all, only a token reduction in their sentence. Prisoners sew garments, assemble furniture, answer customer service calls, and perform order labor behind bars, often for private companies or state-run businesses. Federal Prison Industries, known by its trade name Unicor, produces everything from military uniforms to electronic equipment, earning hundreds of millions in revenue each year by using inmate labor paid far below the minimum wage. Major corporations have quietly benefited too. At various times, companies from retail giants to telecom firms have made use of prison labor to cut costs. Out in the fields and forests, prison chain gangs still deploy in a few states. One can see incarcerated men in orange jumpsuits clearing brush, or even picking crops under the watch of armed guards on horseback, a sight straight from a century ago. The demographics of modern incarceration make the parallel with slavery even starker. African Americans are about 13% of the US population, but nearly 40% of the prison population. Decades of biased policing, harsh sentencing laws, and systemic inequality have led to the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, filling prisons with a workforce that can be exploited under the law. In effect, the exception clause of the 13th Amendment has swallowed the rule. Slavery was abolished for everyone except prisoners, and prisons have been filled with those whom society has relegated to its margins. Activists today openly call prison labor a modern form of slavery, and prisoners themselves have organized strikes to protest their working conditions and the pittance they receive. Worldwide labor exploitation continues in forms both overt and subtle. The International Labour Organization estimates that tens of millions of people today are trapped in conditions of forced labor or modern slavery, from girls trafficked into prostitution, to migrants effectively imprisoned on fishing boats, to families in debt bondage on farms and in factories. Even in sectors without outright coercion, the global economy relies on huge disparities in wealth and power. The coffee beans picked by impoverished farmers, the t-shirts sewn by sweatshop workers, and the minerals mined under hazardous conditions are all part of a supply chain that allows consumers in richer nations to enjoy cheap goods, while workers in poorer regions pay the price. The plantation mindset, that certain groups of people can be worked to the bone for the comfort of others, persists. It has simply been repackaged and exported worldwide. Yet awareness is growing as well. Just as abolitionists once shined a light on the plantation whip, modern labor advocates and human rights groups are exposing these injustices and demanding change. Workers are fighting back. Union drives at e-commerce warehouses in America and strikes at garment factories in Asia show that the struggle against exploitative labor continues. In the United States, movements to abolish private prisons, end unpaid prison labor, and reform harsh criminal justice practices echo the old abolitionist spirit. Globally, campaigns for fair trade, living wages, and corporate accountability press to eliminate child labor and unsafe working conditions from supply chains. Each of these efforts carries an echo of earlier battles, the belief that the brutal spirit of the plantation can be challenged and defeated. And so, my friends, our journey began in the cotton fields of the American South and ends in a world of smartphones and fast fashion, where the threads of the past are woven tightly into the fabric of the present. If you don't understand plantations, you don't understand capitalism. Because the exploitation that built the wealth of yesterday still underpins the wealth of today. The plantation system showed how easily an economic order could prioritize profit over humanity. And that lesson has been learned all too well by generations of industrialists and executives. But understanding this truth also gives us power. The power to see through comforting myths and confront the injustices that still sustain our lifestyles. The ghosts of the plantation still walk among us, in prison yards, in sweatshop floors, in fields where children labor. By acknowledging them, we take the first step toward exercising this legacy and building a more equitable world. Thank you for watching. If this video opened your eyes to the correlation between slavery and capitalism, keep the conversation going by sharing your thoughts in the comments. Give the video a like if you found it valuable, and subscribe for more unfiltered discussions that dig beneath the surface of history. Thanks again. See you in the next one.